Hello, everyone, and welcome to Traffic Corner Tuesday. My name is Paul Kerr, a Client Relationship Manager here at SPAC Enterprise, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. The Traffic Impact Study is the bread and butter of the traffic engineer. This document informs decisions makers on how improvements are necessary to keep things moving when a new development or redevelopment occurs in the area. But one item often overlooked is what goes into those studies and the assumptions traffic engineers make when putting these documents together. So today we'll discuss the traffic impact study policies and how we approach the setting these guidelines when working with our clients, cities, and other government agencies. During this, we want you to join the conversation. Please use the chat box or the Q&A to go ahead and do your comments and questions. We'll try to get to them during, otherwise we do have the Q&A at the end per always. Now, Traffic Corner Tuesday is brought to you by SPAC Consulting, which is part of the SPAC Enterprise family of companies. SPAC Enterprise consists of a group of traffic engineering companies focused on helping you create healthy transportation systems and fixing broken ones. Please visit our websites, countingcars.com or spacconsulting.com, to schedule your consult call. From transportation equipment to traffic counting to engineering studies, we want to help you succeed. Now, today's presenters are Mike Speck and Brian Fiesick. Mike is the founder and creative force and principal writer of the industry-leading blog, Mike on Traffic. Bryant is the president of SPAC Enterprise and regularly contributes to Mike on Traffic, as well as co-hosts these webinars with Mike. Mike and Bryant are licensed professional engineers and certified professional traffic operations engineer. Their combined experience includes hundreds, if not thousands, of traffic impact studies, going more towards the thousands. Much like Farmers Insurance, they know a thing or two because they've seen a thing or two, and they use that knowledge to help direct traffic, to help direct cities on how to set up profiles and policies and guidelines on those studies. Mike and Bryant, please take it away.
Thanks, Bob.
All right,
Thanks, everyone. And if you notice from the titles here, if you've been with us for a while, Bryant got a promotion, and congrats, Bryant.
Thank you.
Now president of the company and leading the day-to-day operations much more. So with that, thanks, Paul. We're excited to be digging into traffic impact studies today and really talking about the bigger picture and the framework cities, counties, and regions can be applying to give better guidance to the consultants doing the impact studies.
So I think with that, we're going to shut off the video, concentrate on the presentation, and we'll go right into our first one of just making sure, what are we talking about here in terms of TIS, Transportation Impact Study, Traffic Impact Assessment. They go by a lot of different names, but they're basically the studies of a development that's coming in. So this is one of our typical cover pages here of what that study would be. And we are not talking about the study itself. So this is not the study itself, but rather this is the policies, the guidelines, the parameters of what goes into that study. So we're really looking at how do you set up these guardrails? How do you tell people what they need to do, basically?
Right. So it's much more figuring out the scope of what's in the traffic study, figuring out what questions need to be answered for the public agency, and then making sure the consultants deliver on
that. All right, there's animation. All right, so as we look at this, as we think about the studies, the guidelines, what goes into them, it's why do we need to do this? Why is it important to review? And we had the poll question in there of how often you review your studies. It looked like a few of you have not done it for quite some time. So this is a picture of basically transportation network back in the 60s, 70s. And as we look at that, it's cars. A lot of cars, a lot of vehicles.
Yeah, the age of suburbia.
Very much so. If we think about today, and what are we looking at with our transportation system,
Right. It's much more multimodal, as this picture represents. We have a roundabout in there. We have a skinnier road. We have pedestrians on the side. We have bike lanes. These are all the things we've been talking about in past Mike on Traffic webinars. But the landscape has really changed all of the way to shared bicycles, Lyft and Uber, and now all of a sudden scooters are showing up in our right of way. So the landscape has totally changed. And so we feel it's important to take 3 steps backwards. And we have found that a lot of agencies don't have any policies, but even if they do have policies, they might be 20 years old. So it's kind of the framework for this important analysis we do hasn't been updated in a long time. So we're excited to share with you. We worked with the Ozarks MPO over the last year and help them as a region work with counties and cities to come up with an overarching policy. And that's really, that's our case study, is the exciting work we did with them to develop a regional policy. And we're going to be going through that today.
Yeah, we'll talk basically the outline of that, and then we'll get into some of the specifics we have too. So we'll start off right off the bat as we look at the policy. How do you do this? And these are what we put together as our general steps. We got 9 of them that we'll go through here. And the very first one is just, you're doing an audit and a check. You're looking at the existing of what do you have right now? Obviously, in order to change it, you need to understand where you start from. What do you have to begin with? So this is a quote from one of the cities we reviewed. Traffic impact studies shall be completed to identify the impacts on the surrounding roadways. So on the surface, it could be a good statement.
Yeah, so that seems straightforward, but let's pick it apart a little bit. Is my daughter Maria supposed to do this traffic impact study? When is it supposed to be done? Who's responsible? What are they studying? Is it multimodal? I mean, just these are things we're going to be covering, but this is so general and vague, it's not helpful at all.
Yeah, it ends up being worthless because if you think about it from a developer standpoint, they're going to look at that and they say, great, the city's going to do a study and they're going to tell us what we need. Well, that might not be the intent. And if you put 4 different people in a room, they're all going to come out with 4 different answers of what this means. And so this is why we want to get down to the specifics in a policy and associated guidelines of what do we actually mean. So kind of those 5 W's: who, what, when, where, why, and how. So then number 2, you know what you have to begin with. Now you need to take a look at what's around, what's the best practices for what you should be using. We'll list a few things here, but please look to us.
Yeah, over the past 12 years, we've written a lot about this. We have ebooks on scoping out traffic studies. Some of our work is referenced by the Florida DOT and their policies. So we have a lot of material on this, and we're very happy to help you.
And we've done a lot trying to think about what our transportation system is today and what we need to study in order to reflect that. So that includes the multimodal aspects and really thinking beyond just vehicle levels of service.
Yes.
ITE, Institute of Transportation Engineers, obviously a good source as well. They are constantly putting out different guidelines. We have helped with a few of them as well. And same sort of thing. They can set the standards for some people and are referenced in different policies. And then lastly, the FHWA. Again, they have people who are looking at these things. They are putting out different types of guides, materials, most of it readily available if you go to their website. All of these are great sources to look at to determine what should we be looking at or what is missed with what our guidelines have today. Which leads us right into number 3, which is obviously, you know what you have, you know what the best practices are. So now you need to update and fill in the gaps.
Yeah, and this is just a matter of updating. It's a pretty simple process to go through that audit. And figure out where the gaps are.
Right. So if we relate this back to what we did for the Ozarks, we reviewed multiple cities, a couple counties, and then their transportation organization, which was the overarching agency for that area. So 10 different government agencies, and they were all over the board with what they were looking at. So again, as we went through these steps, we went through each agency. We looked at what they had, what they didn't have. We combined that with the best practices, and we overhauled their whole system to bring in new standards and say, this is the way you want to move now, which included the triggers for when it is needed. I mean, we've all looked at studies that have been, a senior housing complex or something. I mean, there's just no traffic. Do we really need to look at that?
Right. Or is it just a simple memo saying, hey, there's very little traffic coming out of here. It's not going to be a problem. It can be as simple as that, or just a site plan review to make sure there's clear sight lines at the driveways.
Making sure it's connected to the sidewalks, connects to the bus stops. And those would be very important for senior housing, but you don't need a full traffic impact study to tell you that.
Yeah, you don't need the level of service
operations at the
calculations.
intersection are good.
Right. But then on the flip side, the other end is an NFL stadium or a Mall of America, where you're going to have a couple mile radius of a study area and looking at interchanges. And so it's making sure all the government agencies' needs are met. And that's an important piece of this. When the developers come, they're primarily working with the city staff, and often the planning staff is their liaison into the city. Yet a DOT like MnDOT may be concerned about the interchange, but how do you coordinate every level of government agency involved in a study area?
Yep.
And what we did for the Ozarks was great, because we got all of them together to talk about what are comprehensive guidelines, so they're all on the same page.
Yep. And so filling in those gaps were exactly what we said. Who's doing it? So we tried to identify that, this is facilitated by the cities, but it is the developer that is responsible. How are they doing it? We put in those guidelines, like I said, based on the size of, this is how far out you need to look. Why are they doing it? Try to make sure they had a goal in mind. I mean, we're really looking at providing a transportation system that works for everyone. So with that in mind, I mean, that's important. That's a good framework.
Yeah, and that's how we worked with the Ozarks, but a lot of our city clients here in Minnesota actually will hire us directly to work on the development traffic studies, that they control the engineering process. And that's a philosophical debate city staff should be having and make a decision, but it just needs to be a consistent decision. And hopefully you're hiring reputable engineers that are giving reputable answers no matter who's signing the check. So the fourth step around the whole process is the training. So with Ozarks, we worked with the transportation organization staff to develop the framework after we did the audit and filled in the gaps. But then we came out and facilitated a meeting with all of these agencies in the same room and went through the policies and guidelines and talked them through and made sure we're all on the same page. So that's invaluable to make sure, because I imagine most of the consultants listening, if they have more than a few years of experience, have submitted a traffic study based on one agency saying do this, and then another agency coming in, maybe a county or a state, and saying you totally botched this over here.
Right.
And then it's, if they're giving you conflicting guidance, whose comments do you respond to? So that's the consultants can often be put in a pretty bad position that way.
And another good thing about what we did with the Ozarks, this was a full day training that we had. We brought in engineers, there were planners there, people responsible for this. But we talked through specific examples. So we actually had different sizes of development, different levels, that we were able to talk through specific situations and say, well, this is how we think we would treat this. And then had good question answer afterward, where they came in and they were able to say, well, I've had to deal with this in the past. How does this fall into the guidelines? And we had the group discussion of how we would get there.
And key to that level of conversation is talking about the guiding principles the region is working with. What are your level of service standards? What do you expect? How do you expect things to operate? How much site distance should be provided? And if we can all be on the same page with our guiding principles, that allows the people we work with in the future to apply those principles, even if we haven't come up with that specific case study yet, so that we can define what success looks like and what those guiding principles are, so they can deal with the oddball situations that'll come in the future.
Exactly. So that trains the staff, and then the next piece of that is the education for elected officials. So we want to train the people, obviously, so they know what they're doing. They know how to work with developers. They know how to get these documents prepared, but equally important is the education for the elected officials, so they know what they're looking at. These are generally people who won't have a technical background, or if they do, it's probably not going to be in transportation engineering. And so how do we get them familiar with a document or know what they're looking at and what's a key item that they should be looking at?
Yeah, we're fortunate the city of Edina, one of our good clients here in Minnesota, has hired us, and we're in the middle of putting together a training program. They have a transportation commission for the city, and they've asked us to create a half-hour summary on what that commission, as well as the planning commissioners and city council, just a kind of summary overview video of what are the key pieces of a traffic impact study and what are the few hot button elements that they should be reviewing and thinking about. And key to that is us informing them, what the heck does level of service mean? What is pass fail? What should we be looking at pedestrians? Should we be looking at drop-off zones for Uber and Lyft? And all of these things of what should they be paying attention to? And if we can create a short video for them to watch when they're new in their position, then we don't have to have that re-education at every city council meeting, at every planning commission meeting.
Or after every election. You know, you don't need the meeting, you can give them information ahead of time and say, can you watch this? And this will give you a leg up for when these issues come before us and we need to talk about them.
So we're excited to do that for Edina with Ozarks. Bryant presented to the commission after the one-day training session the next day, and kind of just gave the 15 to 20 minute overview, that high level that the officials need.
All right, so we've gone through training and education. So number 6, we got to make sure we're all screwing in the light bulb the same way. Coordination between agencies. So this is important. Again, we talked about for the Ozarks, the several cities, couple counties, the metro organization, and then obviously the state could come in there too, is how do you coordinate between all these people? How do you make sure they're on the same page? So the training was important to start that process, but what we wrote into the guidelines too were some simple checks of, does it impact a state road? Does it impact a county road? Have you started conversations with them? So just very simple ways that we were driving that coordination and making sure that it has to happen. You can't just say, yes, we're impacting the state road. Our development is adjacent to the state road, but we haven't talked to anybody. Well, that's a red flag. Then make sure you're bringing them into the conversation.
Yeah, and our strong preference is to start those conversations early instead of just dumping a fully baked impact study and say, here, DOT, review this. What do you think?
Right.
We would much rather have everybody at the table at the beginning of the process to raise their concerns. It just ends up being a lot more efficient and collaborative process than just dumping a whole study on someone and make them pick it apart at the end of the process.
And yeah, that's a great point. And that is what we had in the Ozarks, is having some of those questions up front. We wanted that as part of the initial discussion on a development, so that, okay, we haven't done the study yet. We are talking about things, and now we need to bring in these other agencies because we know we are heading the county road or whatever it might be, or the adjacent city.
And next, near and dear to our hearts, since we've unfortunately, early in my career, worked plenty of late nights meeting deadlines, we learned how to develop deadlines we know we can hit, But some cities we've worked in, they just don't have a process, and all of a sudden it's turn in the traffic impact study, and then they have major comments, and then it's the developers, we're before city council next week, and just nobody knows the timeline and getting things done in a logical, progressive manner. We strongly prefer that agencies figure out what is the path, how long do they need to review it, even if somebody's going to be on vacation, to give the milestones so a developer can say, we're going to be at city council on this date. Let's back up to, do we have enough time to meet that, or actually is that not feasible? And we want to have that conversation with clients at the beginning of the process, not a week before they're expecting to be in front of their approvals, which unfortunately I assume some of the other consultants have experienced.
Assuming most have. So yeah, definitely some late nights trying to make deadlines for people, trying to make it work. Equally important on that is, if you are laying these timelines out as an agency, you have to make sure you can fulfill them. Don't tell people you can review a study in 2 weeks if it's going to take you 3. So
yeah, and
make it realistic, even a little on the conservative side, to give yourself enough room. And if you get it done early, great.
Right. So next on the list is the upfront communications. And we've hit on this a little bit, but we want as much communication at the beginning of the process to make sure we are scoping out the correct traffic study. So we're addressing everyone's concerns without wasting time and money. So that we really need everybody at the table talking the same language. And the starting point for us is always figuring out the raw trip generation numbers for development. That's the beginning point for us for scoping out how far in the future are we analyzing, how big of a radius are we studying around the development, what kind of area is dependent on, are you going to be generating 10 cars in rush hour, or are you generating 1,000 cars? They obviously are different size studies needed there.
So for our Ozarks, to bring it back again, we had at the beginning what we call a preliminary assessment. And it's very similar to something we've presented before on these webinars. But the idea is you present the trip generation. What is that? Just raw trip generation, which helps set that level. And then we had a series of questions that went with it that you could just check yes or no. This was intended to be a document that an engineer could do in a couple hours. I mean, just really quick, dirty. Here it is. So are we creating a new access? Are we adjacent to county state roads? So there's a section on site distance.
Section on parking.
Section on parking. So we had questions and different things. Again, intended to be a very short document, but the way we set it up is you had that raw information in front of you, so you could make decisions about the size, but then you had these checklist items, yes or no, that if any of them are checked yes, that's something for you to look into in a little more detail. And one thing we told them about these whole things is that they were guidelines. So as you set these policies up, as you set these guidelines up, they are just that. And if you have something that falls a little bit out of the norm, maybe it is a low vehicle trip generation, but they're creating a new access. Well, then maybe it is more than a memo, even though there's not much more traffic, because you need to study that intersection. You need to make sure that that intersection is okay. Right. And you can go the other way too. You might have a big development that's coming in, but you know what? You've planned for it really well in your comprehensive plan, and it's going into existing access. It can fit right in. You don't really need a big study. You just need to make sure it fits what you had planned for.
Right. And that's key here, is that we're not developing a very extremely rigid process. We're trying to develop those guidelines, those guardrails that the image showed earlier of, if it was just go through this algorithm, then artificial intelligence would do it. We'd all be out of a job. But there certainly is engineering involved. We need our professional judgment. And just these policies are intended to open up that clear communication.
Yep. And by having that communication up front, you can avoid the situation where you've put together this huge document that goes through all these different things, and the city looks at it and goes, yeah, we planned for this here. We just needed a memo that said we were meeting what we planned for.
Right. So then the ninth step, which kind of goes back to scooters showing up, Uber showing up, electric vehicle charging stations, all of these technology is changing things on us rapidly from the 50s when all of this started. These policies and guidelines, ideally you have a mechanism for reviewing and updating them on a recurring basis so that you are utilizing the best practices and you're accounting for today's needs. So that's often lost of we do this kind of work and then it's a set it, forget it, and oh, it's 15 years later. I've seen that too many times now that I'm advancing in my career.
And we don't have any guidelines for how often that review should be. It's really just, you got to stay up to date on what the best practices are and constantly go back to that 1 and 2. What do we have? Do they match best practices? And can often be somebody else having a new set of eyes on it. And it's easy to overlook something if you keep doing it day after day. So periodic would be the word to use there.
Okay. So let's run through. We have about 5 lessons learned from working with the Ozarks through this policy and now other communities. First one is the intent here is we want to provide clear guidance. So everybody is on the same page. Expectations can be met efficiently. And this, if done well, takes a lot of the stress out of the agency engineers and planners. They just say, here's the playbook, go execute the playbook. And that you won't get those last minute, hey, we thought this, or I can't believe you're asking that, and getting into those fights at the last minute right before you're on the city council agenda.
Yeah. Number 2 should be encouraging, or lesson learned is to encourage more communication and then be transparent about the outcome. So we talked about this a lot, but just we feel more communication is better. Just have it up front, lay out what you're thinking, lay out what your study guidelines are, and make sure everybody is on the same page about what you're studying, what those timelines are, how things are moving, and what the ultimate outcome, what you're shooting for.
Yeah, and don't do it in a vacuum. You need to involve neighboring communities, every level of government. Hopefully are all on the same page. It's strange how I see an impact study that just ends at a city border and it doesn't address the next intersection into the next city just because the development isn't in front of that city council. That just doesn't pass my smell test.
Number 3, we said this one as well, that the reviews, and this is specifically the review of your policies. So this is important. It should be a routine exercise. Can be with a new set of eyes. So it could be someone else in the office or someone who is not looking at it day to day, but make sure that's done and make sure you're incorporating, again, those first 2 steps. Do an audit of what you have, compare that against best practices, and you'll know whether you need to change something or not.
And I guess I jumped the gun here and combined number 2 and 4. So number 2 was meant the development team to the city, and number 4 is meant agency to agency. But again, communication.
Yeah, exactly. And then lastly, number 5, just training and education. It's great to have these policies, but if you don't tell anyone about them and you don't all know what they mean, then they're not going to go very far. So make sure you're building that in as part of the process, is to have, again, it kind of goes back to that communication, that talk back and forth, make sure everybody knows what the expectations are and how everything is supposed to go. All right, so thank you, everyone. We are right at our 1 o'clock. So if you need to go, we understand. We will post this later so you can check in, you can review this part of it. We will stay on the line and answer your questions at this time. So feel free to write those in. I know we didn't get to any during the webinar here, but we'll stay on as needed to answer questions. So.
Okay. And then lastly, before Paul starts getting into the questions, we've learned a lot going through the process with multiple communities now. And if you want to schedule a consult with us, if you're a city or a county or MPO, and you want to kind of go through, explore looking at how we went through the process with other communities, we'd be happy to help you out too. So you could go to spacconsulting.com and schedule the free consult to start talking through where you're at and what your needs might be.
So far, I don't have anything right now. Do you guys want to go through the poll real quick?
I thought I saw somebody raise hand.
Here we go. I'm not sure why I didn't get it. Some jurisdictions reference a specific standard, such as 9th edition of trip generation. What is your thoughts on that?
My initial thoughts on that are you need to be careful about referencing a document like that, because we are now onto the 10th generation, and more ITE's trip generation manual is leaving a lot more room for interpretation by the splits of all the different land use types. So I prefer to have leave the room for the interpretation of licensed engineers to calculate the trip generation, and prefer to say, if you're over 100 peak hour trips, you're doing this kind of study versus referencing back to a static. And if you go to the trip generation manual, you'll see that they are referencing right in the beginning, local current trip generation is always preferred. So I think by referencing the trip generation manual, it kind of gives all of us traffic engineers an out to be lazy, and we can end up using limited data sets when we really should be using our judgment on, is that a good enough data set, or do we need to add more trip generation data and make the decision on the new trip generation data?
Someone would like to know, where can they find the regs you wrote?
The regs we wrote, we have not published yet. Those are, that was a consulting project we did for the MPO.
Is it possible to get, if you guys could email the PDF to attendees?
No. We're happy to talk to you about how we could help you with that.
And we do post these as well. So you can always go to YouTube and you can make a copy of this yourself.
If there is a regulation or ordinance, the specific edition of the referenced study, it's a legal issue. The option is not specifically a document. Is that correct?
Go ahead. Yeah, so there's two levels here, and Mike was getting to that. Is there's the first level of the policies that are written, and they're very much harder to change as you look at them. You have to go through your city council. You may need those legal opinions, and that's where we would come in and say those should be updated to provide general assistance, and then reference guidelines, checklists, other information that you can change more easily. So we split that out for Ozarks. We had an example of, here's the policy we think you should put in, which was, again, a little more generic and referenced the study guidelines, which we then had detailed out, and we provided that information, which could be edited as needed, basically, based on what they found worked and didn't work. So
right, there is a hierarchy of, we start with federal laws, then we go to state laws, then we go to city ordinances, then we come down to city policies, which are still approved by the city council, but then we can reference guidelines, and those guidelines can be changed with by city staff without needing government official authorization and approval. So we have a preference of where we put each bucket of information, that we want some things legally referenced, but then we want to be thoughtful on things that may be changing year to year. We want to get those rolling down into guidelines.
You discussed periodically reviewing and updating the guidelines and checklists for TIS review. How often do you recommend having this updated? Is it yearly? Why?
My preference is at the most every 5 years to do a major overhaul, but once a year, kind of year end or whatever the holidays, if you're coming up on the 4th of July, have a rhythm to go through them for an hour with a cup of coffee and say, does this still make sense? Has anything changed? This doesn't need to be a grand get Parliament together type exercise to go through this. It can just be thoughtful. Hey, do we need to tweak something? And I would like to see every agency at least spend a couple of hours once a year going through that.
Yeah, and this is very much talking about the split we have too, that every 5 years can be that legal policy of looking at that and saying, okay, now is the appropriate time to go forward to a city council, county board, whatever it might be, and say, here's some of the changes we think are necessary in the policy and the legal realm. The guidelines then that those policies should reference, those I agree with Mike. I think that's a yearly exercise of just take some time, step away from it, and try to think above the details of what are the outcomes, what are we trying to get to, what's changed, are we covering everything? So I think yearly sounds right to me as well.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
We are happy to help, and please schedule a consult if you have more interest in this. This is a big area we are fleshing out and are going to be rolling out more webinars around the whole city ecosystem, these standards, policies, guidelines. So look for more upcoming, and please put on your calendar for next month. We're doing an Ask the Experts webinar, and so please email Paul, Bryant, myself, any questions you have that we could address in that upcoming webinar. We did this earlier this winter, and it was a wild success. So we'd love to get your questions ahead of time. That helps us prepare a little more educated answers, and some of them are really detailed questions that I know we couldn't have answered on the spot. So get us your questions early. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.